Today we are having this book discussion on Professor Dilip Chakravarty's book, which has been titled Borderlands and Boundaries of the Indian Subcontinent. This book came out in 2016. This is, I think, some of you may have seen this. This is the book, and I've gone through some portions of it. It's a very, it's a scholarly work, so it's rich in detail, references, and very fine and high quality scholarship. I think the book makes a valuable contribution to our understanding of how India's boundaries and how India's political boundaries and strategic frontiers have evolved over centuries. The Indian subcontinent, as we know, is surrounded by Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Tibet, Burma, and the Indian Ocean. It's natural that the interactions amongst people in these areas would have, and these are the areas which we could call India's borderlands, roughly, would have political, economic, and social influence on India. And likewise, the Indian culture and civilization would also have an influence on the people of these regions and also the history of these regions. We all know that geography has deep influence on any country's history, and Robert Kaplan's book and many other books of that ilk, The Revenge of Geography, I think brings this out very clearly, that geographical forces, geography plays on long range, plays on the time frame of centuries. So I think studying geography is extremely important, and it is for this reason that neighbors, India's neighbors, present-day neighbors, they occupy such an important role in our foreign policy. So India's Act East policy, Look East policy, Connect Central Asia policy, etc., is a reflection of the importance of geography on India. We simply cannot ignore these regions and what happens here. A noted archaeologist and historian, Professor Chakravarthy, is the Emeritus Professor of South Asian Archaeology in the Department of Archaeology at Cambridge University, UK. He has done archaeological surveys in Kannada Valley, the whole of Chota Nagpur Plateau, the whole of Ganga Yamuna Plain, the Haryana Punjab area between 1980 and 2008. He has also participated in archaeological field expeditions in India and Iran. Professor Chakravarthy is a giant in his field. He has co-authored and authored 29 books based on his field research, and the list of books is here, and it covers the history of Indian archaeology, the politics of Indian archaeology, and of course the details of his various surveys that he has carried and the importance of archaeology, etc. So I think it's a very substantive work he has done, and as a result, this year he got Padma Shri also. He was awarded the Padma Shri. And we are very fortunate that he's a distinguished fellow at the VIF for several years. And equally important, he is the editor of the VIF series of History of Ancient India, and 7 volumes have already been brought out, and 4 more volumes are under preparation. Coming back to his book, Professor Chakravarthy, in his introduction, observes perceptively that to understand the flow of events in Indian history, and I'm quoting from his book, to understand the flow of events in the Indian history through the ages, it is essential that we try to understand the geographical and historical nuances of the Indian borderlands, unquote. Indeed, looking at India from the prism of its borderlands would be a novel approach to understanding India and modern India's foreign and security dilemmas. But unfortunately, we do not do so. Either it's because of indifference, or laziness, or the lack of knowledge. Sometimes in our foreign policy, we ignore the importance of the bordering areas such as Tibet, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, just to give you some examples. And what's the result? The result is that we have massive problems such as India-China boundary dispute, we have the turmoil in Afghanistan, we have the Kashmir issue, we have the Pakistan problem, and we have a whole lot of insurgencies in Northeast. Professor Chakravarthy's book is a scholarly work which deals with geographical and historical perspectives of Central Asia, Iran, Baluchistan, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and Myanmar. In the process, we learn a lot about the Silk Road, the Durand Line, the McMahon Line, the spread of Buddhism to Central Asia, Buddhism in Tibet, Mongolia, and a whole lot of other subjects which are of great interest for foreign policy makers and otherwise also. We also learn about the Ahom invasion of Indian Northeast in the 20th century, 12th century, and developments in Myanmar, Irrawaddy Valley, etc. And Professor Chakravarthy's research is based on his archaeological studies, field surveys, and of course many other sources. He feels that the historic picture in many parts of India's borderlands, as for instance in the Irrawaddy Valley, is still not complete. I think so there is a need for more work in these areas. The book, of course, is a delightful read, and what is most visually most appealing is the large number of maps that the book has from the Imperial Gazette of India, covering Afghanistan, Baluchistan, northern frontiers, Tibet, Nepal, Myanmar, etc. And he has 5 pages of dense bibliography containing the references which would be of great use to the academics and general readers as well. Friends, we are today, India is at a cusp of accelerated growth and rise. There is a need for us to spend more resources in archaeological, historical, geographical, cultural, anthropological, linguistic studies. Foreigners have done most of this research, and but there is a need to build a strong research group or groups in India. This cannot happen unless we support and expand our current institutions like the Archaeological Survey of India, and we have the Director General here, Survey of India, National Archives, museums, universities, etc. Unfortunately, there is an absence of strategic thinking and strategy among the policymakers who are either unaware or reluctant to invest in India's history. What areas could be considered as borderlands? This is something which comes out of his research, and I just picked up a couple of sentences. Essentially, the borderlands are the areas where there is a clear Indian imprint mixing with the local influences. That's why their importance as well. The vast swath of territory from the Gulf to Xinjiang in the west, as he says, and Arunachal Pradesh, Myanmar in the east, all these areas, and it's a vast area, clearly fall in the category of the borderlands. And need to study these borderlands is very urgent, considering that we are now reaching out to the rest of the world. Unless we know our own history, nobody will take you seriously. And the Chinese are doing a lot of work. One interesting insight the book offers is this: to what extent were the foreign invasions of India were truly foreign, considering that most of them, from the Achaemenids to the Mughals, and I'm quoting from his book, emanated from the borderlands. The point is that borderlands of India are very much a part of India's history. Be that as it may, the VIF is delighted to arrange this discussion around Professor Chakravarthy's book on a highly interesting and crucial subject of India's borderlands, in the hope that the book will lead to more academic research and also lead to greater public awareness. I would like to welcome Dr. B.R. Mani, a noted archaeologist and presently the DG of National Museum and the Vice Chancellor of National Museum Institute. Ambassador Rajiv Sikri, formerly the Secretary of Ministry of External Affairs and Ambassador to Kazakhstan, and also the author of the best-selling book on rethinking India's foreign policy. And he also has a lot of interest in Borderlands, has contributed a lot to our discussions within the VIF on these areas. Professor Kulbhushan Wareku, who was a professor of the GNU and who has made a notable contribution to the Himalayan and Central Asian studies. He is also a founder editor of the Quarterly Journal of Himalayan and Central Asian Studies, which started its publication in 1997 and has continued unbroken. Then Professor Sujit Datta, Distinguished Fellow at the VIF and the editor of our publication, National Security. Dr. Abanti Bhattacharya, my former colleague from the IDSA, now an associate professor at the Department of East Asian Studies, Delhi University, an expert on China. And I was also very pleased to see today Ambassador Praveen Goyal, who rarely comes here, but today, because of the interest in this subject, he's visiting us, and many other people. I don't think I have the time to go through all the names here, but thank you very much for coming. And now we will start our discussions. And I'll first invite Professor Dilip Chakravarthy to introduce his book and say a few words. And then we will have a discussion by the panelists. And our panelists are Dr. B.R. Mani, Ambassador Rajiv Sikri, Professor K. Wareku, Professor Sujit Datta, and Dr. Abanti Bhattacharya. And after that, we will have an interactive session, and then we'll close with the lunch. So I will request Professor Chakravarthy to introduce the book in about 15 minutes, subject in about 15 minutes. And then I'll request my panelists to make their interventions in about 10 minutes each, and then we could take up the interactive session. So may I request Professor Chakravarthy to kindly make his remarks.
Dr. Gupta and learned colleagues and friends, I must begin by thanking Dr. Gupta most warmly for his kindness in making this volume a subject of book discussion at this institute. It's been very kind of him. Now, this book has a background. I'm a student of archaeology, and some years back, till some years ago, Indian archaeologists were obsessive about India's contacts with West and Central Asia. Every new type of artifact found in the Indian context was attributed to these contacts, irrespective of the presence or absence of any positive proof. Deeply dissatisfied with this approach, I decided to closely examine if this approach fulfilled the geographic parameters necessary for such contacts. I published a paper on this in 1977, but could take up the issue in detail only in 2008, could publish this issue in detail only in 2018. The present book is a result of this interest. Here I examine the basic geography of the entire stretch of the subcontinent's boundary line between Baluchistan and Myanmar, with reference to the elements of political, economic, and religious interaction across the borderlands of this vast region. This would give us an idea of the geographical and historical position of the subcontinent in the Eurasian landmass and India's position as a civilizational unit. Now, for this session, let me focus on what I have written on Tibet. Tibet, despite being a high plateau, this will just give you an idea of what the book is about. Tibet, despite being a high plateau, has a long history of occupation right from the prehistoric periods. It was well populated by the standard of the day, and in view of its difficult geography, and is Tibet, however, was well linked by roots with eastern China, Xinjiang, and Mongolia beyond it, and India. China's relationship with Tibet assumed the color of paramountcy only after the Qing dynasty established its power in Tibet after 1712, and even then, for long subsequent stretches, China did not enjoy absolute power in Tibet. To describe Tibet in any way as the part of the Chinese motherland is a travesty of historical truth, just as to deny the legal validity of the treaty, which resulted in the McMahon Line on the ground that it was not formally ratified by China, is possibly an unwarranted assumption, because was a formal ratification by China of any agreement between Tibet and another government during that period obligatory in the first place? Further, did the newly drawn line between British India and Tibet violate the normal principle of boundary demarcation? This is unlikely to be the case, because mountain crests offer normal boundary points in a mountainous territory, and the McMahon Line tried to base itself on the mountain crests between Tibet and British India as far as practicable. There is apparently no documentary proof that a long section of Arunachal was under Tibetan occupation for any significant length of time. On the other hand, there is evidence that there was a major Indian pilgrim place called Brahmakund well inside the Lohit Valley in eastern Arunachal, which also had the presence of Indian merchants and old Indian icons dating from the 10th-12th centuries AD. Regarding Indian interaction with Tibet, its religion, Buddhism, was an Indian contribution. Tibetan kings at some point successfully invaded Nepal and parts of northern India, just as the Nepalese at one point invaded Tibet and had Nepalese traders offered protection in Lhasa. Economically, Tibet had extensive trade with a vast zone from Kashmir to Arunachal Pradesh. The third sector, now I come to our relationship with Myanmar area. The third sector begins at the northeastern corner of Arunachal and the hills of the Patkai range and Arakan Yoma at the border of the subcontinent and Myanmar, and continue down to Cape Negre, the farthest tip of Myanmar, to create a world where the sense of geographical separation between Myanmar and the subcontinent was complete. This separation, however, was no deterrent to the historical generation of a marked Indian imprint on both the Irrawaddy Valley and the attached Arakan Delta and coast to its east. For a long time in the post-Gupta period of Indian history, the Arakan-based kingdom of Archaeological seems to have pushed its control or area of influence up to the Meghna estuary in modern Bangladesh. The fact that some Arakanese kings in the 14th century contributed to the development of Bengali vernacular literature should not come as a matter of surprise in view of a long history of Arakan's interaction with the Bengal coast, which is manifest in many ways, including Indian-style ancient Sanskrit inscriptions and names of kings with unmistakably Sanskritized names. Arakan's architecture and sculptural wealth closely matches the splendor of post-Gupta art and architecture of Eastern India, and its early cities of Dhandavati and Vaishali were apparently modeled on the early historic Indian cities of the Ganga Valley down to the use of the script and language. In many ways, the Indian imprint that one can see on the history of Arakan can also be seen in the Irrawaddy Valley, where the major historic settlements of Baitkano, Halin, and Etcetera recall the plans of the Gangetic Valley early historic cities. The dynastic names were Indian, although no king list is forthcoming. The script was derived from a version of the Brahmi script. Both Buddhism and Hinduism were pervasive throughout the Irrawaddy Valley and the Delta. Baitkano was dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, and the Shri Kshetra connoted Shri, or the Hindu goddess of prosperity. Myanmar also had exerted influence on Indian political history on its own. Its most important example is the movement of the Thai language-speaking people from the Myanmar-China border to the upper Brahmaputra Valley in Assam in the early 13th century, to subsequently carve out a large kingdom on both banks of the Brahmaputra. This kingdom survived till the 19th century. Because of the maritime possibilities of both the Arakan coast and the Irrawaddy Delta, some parts of the subcontinent, especially the sphere linked to the Bay of Bengal, could reach out to Arakan and the Irrawaddy Delta by sea. In any case, this is the basic tenor of my narrative throughout the book. I offer a lot of archaeological and historical details, and of course geographical details, and examine the interaction in the field of politics, religion, trade, etc. Two areas emerge very specifically as far as Indian imprint is concerned. And on both these contexts, very extensive research is necessary. It's badly necessary. One is the Chinese province of Xinjiang. Xinjiang, how do I put it? In the context of Southeast Asia, scholars have used the term Indianized states. As far as Xinjiang is concerned, I believe that most of the ancient states of that area were based mostly on Indian ideology of various sorts. Their script was Indian, their kings were Indian, these are documented sources. Lots of choristry documents were found by Orlstein in that section. What is unfortunate is that we in India have not developed the necessary expertise to go through this data firsthand. This is very surprising, and Dr. Mani here will certainly agree with me that his museum has got a collection of Stein material, and I believe the only serious work which has been done took place many years ago. So this is a serious issue. Actually, a very surprising issue, considering that we can claim Xianzhang to be a part of the Indian civilization for most of its existence. Another point is Myanmar. Myanmar also was very, very much within the Indian orbit. Its early historic cities, the core points of its civilization, were Indian in origin. You don't have to be a student of archaeology to understand this. The basic plans of the cities that have been published will tell you that. Arakan, some of the finest post-Gupta art specimens have been located in Arakan. Now, unfortunately, we Indians have not worked on this material. I had to depend on Australian work. Actually, a couple of Australians that explored Arakan quite well, published the material, etc. So these are the two basic areas on which much research is necessary. As far as the other areas are concerned, say take the case of Iran, it is more or less well known. Iran's geography is well known, Iran's contacts with India is well known. Central Asia also is unlikely to offer many surprises. South of Kazakhstan, to the southern border of Afghanistan, and between Dunhuang and the eastern shores of the Caspian, this part of Central Asia, I don't think it contains any surprise from the Indian point of view anymore. But again, Indian presence, the field of ancient history of Central Asia has been marginal. Most of us don't know the sources. I don't know the Central Asian sources in the sense that I can't read the old languages of the area and thus can't make any expert comment at all. So, further, Afghanistan. Now, the beauty about Afghanistan is it was never an independent state. This is kind of, this state has always been put together by various other forces. In Afghanistan also, Indian presence is very sharp. We have got Sanskrit towns for each part of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is full of Buddhist ruins and some Hindu ruins too. Magnificent archaeological finds, magnificent evidence of trade contacts and so on. But again, has any Indian worked on Afghanistan ancient history at first hand? No. This is very unfortunate. Can I think of anybody? Not really. Can you think of anybody? So we should focus on these elements without depending too much on the opinions of foreign scholars who certainly have a socio-political attitude of their own. We have to build up a base of basic research in these areas in India. I know that some modern institutes of Delhi and other places, they're interested in these geographical areas, but I don't think their interest extends back to ancient history. And I believe that we should also be very forthcoming about our comments on these so-called modern controversies. As far as the McMahon line goes, I mean, there should not be any controversy at all. I'm no student of geopolitics or professional student of diplomacy, but even I could make out on the basis of whatever sources have been published that at least one party has been trying to be a bully. Now, the bullies are best confronted by being very tough. In any case, I do hope that if you look at the book closely, this will give an idea how the thing was in the ancient context, what are the major areas which had Indian imprint, strong Indian imprint. Afghanistan, the whole of it, Xinjiang, and the southern part of Central Asia, the part of the Indian borderlands. Turkmenia, I will not say the whole of Turkmenia, but certainly the southern part of Turkmenia, the area around modern Ashgabat and all that. The whole of Xinjiang, southern Tibet entirely, and apparently the whole of Myanmar. Now, many Indian cultural traits had their origin in these areas, and I'm very happy to say that Dr. Gupta got hold of that very important point of the book, that the so-called foreign invasions of India emanated from our borderlands, not from the really foreign areas. I made this point many years ago in my paper in 1977, but nobody took any notice of that. And suddenly I find our group taking note of this point, so I'm very happy. Now, we don't know how to explain this. Why the so-called foreign invasions emanated only in our borderlands? There must be some reason. Professor Wariku here is very familiar with the primary sources of this area, especially regarding trade. So I'm sure that you'll have some comments to make on this. In Xinjiang, you see, a game has been going on in the field of Xinjiang studies. There's a gentleman in Seattle, is it in Kannada or the United States? United States. In any case, they've got Department of Buddhist Studies and a gentleman called Solomon. He is an expert in the Prakrit. They are trying to make out that it is not the normal Indian Prakrit which was in use there. It was a Gandhari Prakrit. Not influence of the Indian mainland. Influence of one of the marginal areas. This is how academics play politics. And we must be aware of these nuances of our, but you see, there is no Indian expert. No Indian has yet written a Gandhari Prakrit. So what can we say? In any case, I'm very happy that this publication has come in for some attention at the VIF. and I look forward to listening to the comments made by our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chakravarthy, for those remarks, and also underlining the fact that how poor we are in our own research about these vital and sensitive areas. Many of us have visited some of these areas. Ambassador Sikri was ambassador in Kazakhstan. Ambassador Rangachari knows China very well. I myself have visited some parts of Central Asia. Now, if you go to, for instance, Ashgabat, I was there about a couple of years ago, and it's Parthian civilization, and they have done some wonderful work in terms of archaeology, etc. But all their work was based on the Russian archaeological work, and that is what they are still continuing. Now, we had a chance of striking close partnerships with the Russians, with the Central Asia, when Central Asia was part of Russia, etc. I don't know why our Ministry of External Affairs and our missions in Afghanistan and these areas did not put this historical research right in the center of our foreign policy. But probably we were not thinking, our mindset was not really, we were thinking in a very narrow box of South Asia, just deal with our own little boundaries that we have, and never really thought about these extended terms. The British did, the Mughals did. If you look at our own history, some of these areas like Kandahar, every empire wanted to have a control over Kandahar. It was so very important. Everybody. I mean, there was so much of, between the Persians and between the Indians, there was always this struggle for Kandahar. And then, of course, in Harappa, you yourself have mentioned Shotugai, we have learned from your books, Shotugai in Harappa civilization, or now Indus Saraswati civilization, which is right on Tajikistan-Afghanistan border. That was such an important point where our influence was there. So I think Indian imprint, we must really delineate it properly. But then there is this lack of knowledge and research, which is really very sad. But let me now come to our panelists. And I request Dr. B.R. Mani, who is the Director General of National Museum, to make his remarks in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Gupta, Professor Chakrabarti, and distinguished guests and scholars in this hall. The book, The Borderlands and Boundaries of the Indian Subcontinent, describes cultural undercurrents flowing from Baluchistan in the northwest to the Patkai range and Arakan, Yoma in the east, impacting upon a relationship between India and the countries and lands beyond its traditional boundaries. Cultural exchanges have been studied by the learned author, Professor D.K. Chakravarthy, considering the geopolitical and cultural situations prevailing in the region. From the movement of armies, Buddhist monks and traders through passes and routes such as Uttarapath, the author has discussed about present-day politics also on these borders. Politics from earliest times till present day has been discussed, and the impacts of geological and geographical situations have been discussed, how they have impacted upon the culture and art and transactions between countries around India and development of these areas. Beyond Baluchistan and Gandhar and Hindu Kush or Madhya Gandhar and Kamboj, that was the region of Bahlik, about which details have been discussed in this book. We also know from early literature, even from the later Vedic literature like Bodhayan Shraut Sutra, where the movement of people in the region has been mentioned. And earlier it was thought that probably there was the movement only from west to east, but now the latest researches suggest that movement was also from east to west, which is quite clearly shown in Bodhayan Shraut Sutra, where it is mentioned that the two sons of Pururva were sent to two directions, east and west, one towards Panchal and Magad region, and the other one went from the state of Pururva to west. First of all, he settled at Gandhar, then he moved to Parshu, what is called there, and Parshu is nothing but Faras or Persia of the present day. And then he further moved towards Arat, which can be identified with Ararat in Iraq. So such details require to be worked out, which show that the movement was not just from west to east, but it was also from east to west. We know about Baku, where the fire temple is there. From earliest times, we also learn about the Devasur Sangram or Dashragya war, which was certainly, which took place certainly in the Indo-Iranian borderlands. Now, about Bahlik, which is the borderland beyond the traditional boundaries of India. It is the same as Balkh or Bactria in Afghanistan and beyond, even across the river Oxus, Amudarya. And across the river, we have seen that how the civilization from 1st century BC onwards developed there, basically of Buddhist sites and cities. I had myself the chance to visit those areas in the Surkhandaria region and also around the old Termiz, where Karatepe, Feaztepe, and other sites are there. These are the two Buddhist sites, and the site of Kampir Tepe is also there, and then there are restrictions at present to go to some other sites. There was restriction also to go to Karatepe, but I could somehow manage to see that. And if you reach to those sites, you seem to, it seems that you are moving on some Buddhist site in the North India. The pottery, the antiquities, everything is mostly of the same origin. You get lots of potsherds with painted or inscribed inscriptions in Brahmi as well as in Kharoshti. So all these things require further studies and further investigation into the understanding of cultural undercurrents, which were influencing the region which is more than 1,500 kilometers beyond present day boundaries of the country. I had also the occasion to visit Turkmenistan, and there I had visited Nisa, which is a site which is connected with the Parthian developments, and Buddhist remains are there at Nisa also. And a particular type of impact was there, which I could see in a World Heritage Site at Kunya Urgench, where even today the graves, the Muslim graves, are formed like a shallow stoop. It is not like the graves which we have in India or Pakistan. And even I had seen people taking circumambulation of these circular graves. So it was a pleasant surprise, and I could understand that it was probably the, the influence of the Kushans, as this site is located towards south west of Uzbekistan, and probably that influence had reached to that place very easily. In Kazakhstan, we have, and also in Kyrgyzstan, we have the ibex figures, which are very common in the Hunza area as well as in Ladakh, right from prehistoric times onwards. And there was a tradition of which is called Thuma Saling in pre-Buddhist Ladakh, which continued further. So, and then there are certain Buddhist remains also available. In Ustrushna, that is in Sogdian contacts in Tajikistan, also we get Indian interactions. We also know about the Romak and Polish and Tajik doctrines in astronomy. Indian languages and scripts, they reached all these regions and influenced the culture through the language and script. The Gandhari Prakrit, about which Professor Chakravarthy has just mentioned, it requires studies, and there is no one in the country who is studying this particular aspect. And people are sometimes, when the Arabatak inscription was found in Afghanistan, people were not understanding the difference between the Tokharin language and script, and as well as what was the actual Gandhari Prakrit. So these are the areas where researchers should be provoked to study the impacts and the details. China, Japan, Korea in north, Sri Lanka in south. And I would like to mention here that apart from the land routes, there were silk routes also, through which Sri Lanka, not only just Sri Lanka, but Maldives was also connected. And in Maldives, unfortunately, in 2012, a large number of Buddhist remains and Buddhist sculptures, which were made in coral stones, they were smashed by some extremists who attacked the National Museum at Male. So, but fortunately, we have the record of available of them, and the government of India is also trying to restore some of these objects, and we are in contact with the Maldivian authorities to have a proper interaction. Later on, we find that there was a contact between in the medieval times also between Uzbeks and the Mughals and other tribes and clans flourishing in all over that region. I'm not going into details because I've just kept one side, Central Asia, but we have the impacts in Southeast Asia as well as in Myanmar side. We know about the Ahoms who came to Assam and settled their kingship in Assam, who followed the routes from Thailand to Burma and then settling in Assam. We also know about the Vietnam, where even today there are the descendants of those who went and proclaimed Hindu and Buddhist traditions in the country. Those people are in minority there, and they are called Boloman, or since they are in Cham language, because these Bolomans are the Brahmanas who settled there, but since they were following Shaivism, mostly Shaivism, they were not given the proper citizenship. So they are living in the hilly regions at present. The peninsular part of Indian subcontinent, with its connections with regions in Indian Ocean, also requires to be highlighted. And I would also suggest Professor Chakravarthy that in the second edition of the book, if he can include Nepal and these regions, that would be something very interesting and important for the study of the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think you have also added some additional information. We'll come to those discussions a little bit later. So now may I request Ambassador Rajiv Sikri to make his remarks here.
Thank you, Arvind, and I want to really compliment Professor Chakrabarti on an outstanding work. I went through it with great interest because I have visited many of the places that he has talked about, having spent 4.5 years in Kazakhstan and earlier traveled quite extensively across Eurasia, from Mongolia to Xinjiang to Astrakhan and Baku and all those places. So as a student of history, I had an interest in it, but to visit those places was fantastic. And I think your book has given a much needed scholarly background and highlighted the importance of studying our links, India's links with its neighbors. In fact, the book brings out very clearly the question, what is India? Which I think has to mean the broader concept of the land beyond the Sindh River and extending up to as much as the geographical boundaries permitted, which is what you have mentioned, Professor Chakravarthy, the Arakan region and and Burma. Though I think that the dividing line really is the Irrawaddy river, because east of the Irrawaddy there is more Chinese influence. It's all a factor of geography. In fact, the first Secretary General of the Ministry of External Affairs, Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai, talked about 3 three circles of Indian security. The innermost, he said, and I think he's absolutely right, extended from the Hindu Kush to the Irrawaddy, which is our borderlands, basically. The second was from Aden and Hormuz to Malacca, the choke points of the Indian Ocean. And the third was Suez to Shanghai. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And we know, that the whole of Southeast Asia was really known as Greater India. It was not known as Southeast Asia, and Indochina was where the Chinese and the Indian civilizations met. And of course, these fantastic archaeological discoveries, whether it is Borobudur or Angkor Wat or the Mission in Vietnam, and they all Bali, they're all testimony to the growth of the Indian cultural influences and language and religion there. So we have actually forgotten that we were and are a great civilization. And we have unfortunately begun to think of ourselves only in the context of the present day boundaries, political boundaries of India, whereas our influence is much broader than that. So just as there is a cynic world which China dominates, there is an Indian world which India is, an Indic world which is dominated by Indian culture and civilization. And I think that your work brings out the importance of recognizing this Indic world and getting a more complete sense of who we are, who we were. I think that's very important for self-realization, because one of the things which has happened over the last 70 years is that we think, oh, Pakistan is our neighbor, Bangladesh is our neighbor, Nepal is our neighbor, Sri Lanka is our neighbor, but these are artificial neighbors. And part of our problem with all these neighbors is that they cannot detach themselves from India. So our real neighbors are Iran, Central Asia, and in Southeast Asia with Indonesia or whatever it is. The geography of India is what makes India great in the past and potentially in the future. Because I believe that India is central to Asia. We can reach out, and we have reached out in the past, to East Africa, to South Africa, to Mauritius, Seychelles, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the Arab world. We've reached out to Central Asia. We've reached out to Tibet and Xinjiang. Our influence is there. And we've reached out to Southeast Asia. So, because of this centrality, India was critical to the success of the British Empire. That's why it was called the jewel in the crown. Because without India, there would have been no expansion of Britain in Asia. It was the Indian opium which led to the expansion into China and the prosperity. It was, the Gulf countries had Indian rupee there as the currency till a few decades ago. Historically, there were times when Samarkand and Delhi were under the same rule. How can we forget that? It was rightly mentioned about Kandahar, the importance of Kandahar. And it is said, going back to the Ramayana, that, Gandhari was from Kandahar and Kakai was from the Caucasus. So there is that, I don't know how true it is, maybe it is scholars like you who can bring it out, but there is that talk. I'm so glad that you have Professor Chakravarthy looked at this whole Eurasian space in the true geopolitical context. Because when I was in Kazakhstan, and people talk about Central Asia, and most people didn't even know which these countries were, and somebody told me, he said, "Oh, Rajiv, you're going to one of those stans, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." And then my mother, when I was posted, she said, "You're going to Kazakhstan. Where is it?" So I just told her, I said, "Take a straight line north of Delhi, and 3 hours away, you're in Kazakhstan." So anyway, that was the ignorance. But I think that ignorance is also born out of a lack of understanding of geography. And the geography that we imbibed was based on what we were taught. I found it so difficult. Even today, it's probably a little easier, but I think it's still very difficult to find a map of this region with the Pamirs at the center. And unless you put the Pamirs at the center, you cannot understand the geopolitical significance and the roots and so forth of this region. Because you have a Chinese map and this is on one end, the Indian map and that's on one end. You have a Russian Soviet map, it's on one end. So where does it, but it all comes together there. So I think that map making and understanding of geography is absolutely critical. Both you and Dr. Gupta mentioned about how the invasions came from our borderlands, which is true. But I have a little twist to that. All invasions emanated from Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the critical platform for the invasion of India. And that is the geopolitical significance of Afghanistan. Why Afghanistan matters to India. Even today, it may not be a physical invasion, but the terrorist and jihadi invasion is based in Afghanistan. And that is why we need to have some degree of influence on what happens there. In fact, Afghanistan is what I believe, what I have called a negative security space. A space which does not by itself matter very much because it's poor, it's landlocked, and so forth, but for its neighbors was critical. So no neighbor wanted another to get control of Afghanistan, whether it was the Persians or the Central Asians or the Indians, because they realized that the interconnection between these three regions, Central Asia, Persia and India, was via Afghanistan. And therefore the control of Afghanistan was absolutely critical historically for all these countries. I will talk a little bit about Central Asia and Eurasia because I understand it a little better. I don't understand Myanmar as much, but I think that the Indian connection is brought out by the fact that, the Indian connection is there and also a little different because of geography. The proximity to India, particularly the region west of the Irrawaddy, meant that there was a lot of influence. We had so many Indians who went there. My own aunt was born in Rangoon. And you had that famous song, Mera Piya Gaya Rangoon, Udhar se aaya telephone. You remember that? So there was that thing. And so many Indians were thrown out of Yangon and Burma. And there's still many there who are there. So that connection is there, but it is the hills to the east which prevent the free flow, and the fact that the rivers are in a north-south direction, so you have to cross many valleys in order to reach there. That kept Burma a little separate from India. So the India really is the Indo-Gangetic plain. And even the Assam was a little separate because of the Brahmaputra and the width, and the Arunachal was away because the bridges were not there and so forth. But Central Asia, which has played a huge part in our history, is something that we need to understand much better. And I think those of us who have flown to Central Asia and now in recent times, many have flown. Maybe not so much when you fly to Tashkent or Turkmenistan, Ashgabat, but certainly if you fly from Delhi to Almaty, all you see after 5 or 10 minutes are mountains. And in a sense, there's a whole range of mountains. Geographical barrier is Dehradun at one end, say, and Almaty at the other, because that is where the Tian Shan range ends. The rest is, you have the Kunlun and the Pamirs and the Karakoram and the Himalayas and so forth. So that is the area which is the general mountainous area. Tibet and Xinjiang, you've talked about it, I think are extremely important for us to study, to understand, because they are occupied by China, and I use this word deliberately because, as has been pointed out, they have very little connection with China culturally, historically. They are more connected with India, and both in terms of the temperament, and we need to study these far more closely, because what happens to China as a global power? Okay, we are there with the rest of the world, but Xinjiang in Tibet is where the rubber meets the road. That's where those parts of Central Asia occupied by China meet India. And therefore, we have to study what is happening there very closely. We have to study the links, build up on the links, and so forth. I did a few years ago an exhibition of photographs at the India International Center, which is called From Xi'an to Astrakhan. And it drew a lot of response because people don't know enough about these places. And in Kazakhstan, as was pointed out, it was really the Russian scholars and archaeologists who were doing the work. But there was just a handful of people. The state did not do much. And even in the post-independent Central Asian states, there's not much work being done, just ignored it. This was something exotic. When I reached Kazakhstan in 1995, I made some inquiries, and I had heard that I had heard from Deepak Malik, who was there as the Chargé d'Affaires before me, that there was this place, near Almaty, which had these Buddhist carvings, and I tried to find out where it was, and nobody locally seemed to know. So I put my driver on the job, and he found out and so forth, and we drove 2 hours into the desert, and an unmarked road leading to the left, and after about half an hour, we came across these sites, and which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Tamgalitas, which you have mentioned in your book. Fantastic carvings of Buddha, but they were in a script I did not understand. The Kazakhs did not understand, and it was only 3 years later when Stobden came as the director of the cultural center. I took him there. I said, Stobden, see what this is. He says, this is in old, I don't know, combination of Mongolian, but it was an Om Padma Sam, okay, Om Mani Padma Sam. It's all that. So that is what has happened. I have visited Balasugun, Nisa, of course. Well, Uttrar is gone, but Kashgar, Dunhuang, Urumqi, of course, and Turfan, and all those places apart from Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and so forth. And Isfahan, I don't know if any of you have visited Isfahan, but it is such a jewel. Now, the mention was made of the trading links that we had, and of course, the 2 places in India, which were 3 places, were one Ladakh, Leh, which was connecting there. There was Amritsar, and there was Multan. because of the geography which was there. So I remember in Isfahan, I went there and I saw a beautiful, something which looked like a pashmina shawl, not a pashmina, a jamawar shawl. By the way, I saw a fantastic jamawar wall hanging, must have been about 3/4 of this in Astrakhan. I said, how much is this worth, Anyway, in Isfahan, I bought some stuff and so forth, and I ran out of money. And I said, you take a credit card. So this chap talked in Farsi, and I didn't understand it. I had an interpreter, but there were two words he said which I understood, and that made perfect sense. One, he said, American. Two, he said, Haramzadeh. I said, okay, now that's okay. But the point I was trying to make is, I said, I don't have money. I had run out of US dollars. He said, what do you have? I said, I've got Indian rupees. He says, I'll take them. I said, what will you do with rupees? He said, no, we have a lot of trading traditionally, and so forth. So this is just to emphasize these things. Now, just 1 minute more I will take, because I think I've taken too long already. I think that we need to somehow revive these links with Central Asia, which is extremely important because these now have a geopolitical importance for us. The Karakoram Highway, the CPEC, all that is coming through this area. And it is because of this physical linkage that Pakistan and Chinese occupied Xinjiang have that is there. But I think with the Chinese, we should certainly be telling them that you think that Tibet is yours. Well, Kailash and Mansarovar are the abode of our God. Lord Shiva's abode is Kailash. So if one of the Dalai Lamas was born in Tawang, it doesn't matter. And millions of Indians have traveled there, not thinking they were going to a foreign country, but this was the Punya Bhumi of Indians. So I think that there is a larger geopolitical objective which has been served by our book. Only two suggestions I would have for any subsequent edition. While you have some excellent maps there, I think that for a book of this nature, more detailed maps of the region would be absolutely essential, because it's very difficult to understand. As I said, I could follow a lot because I've traveled these routes, but somebody who has not traveled would find it a little difficult to follow. But it is invaluable what you have stated. I must compliment you. And secondly, one of those maps has to be with the Pamirs at the center, so that you have this there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Sikri, for those remarks. I think it's brought in your personal feel of the place as well. It is very useful. Now we are running a little bit late. Now I request Professor Kulbhushan Wariku to say a few words, but kindly stick
Thank
to
you.
about
Thank
10
you, sir.
minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Chakravarthy has undertaken a stupendous task of studying and recording the borderlands and boundaries of the subcontinent, right from Hindu Kush through Karakoram, Chitral, Gilgit, Hunza, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh up to the Arakan Hills. This study delves into the geographical, historical, religious and economic interaction and complexities of the borderlands, which have been a zone of interaction through history. Whereas Bridge took interest in exploring, mapping and demarcating borderlands in Iran and Afghanistan, northern frontiers did not receive attention due to the British priority of appeasing China to keep Russians at bay near Pamirs and around. Professor Chakravarthy draws attention to the importance of Iran and route from Zabul and Zaidan to Mashhad, which has now assumed importance due to the connectivity between Afghanistan and Central Asia through Chabahar. You have made mention of the sway of Hindu Shahis of Kabul. I should give you personal experience. I was there in Kabul for about 7 days, few years back, and while staying in a hotel on the third, fourth story, I could see a hill like Hari Parvat in Srinagar. So somehow I got a feeling, I don't know how I got it, I thought it is something sacred space. I got a strong feeling about that. So when he is now Education Minister, Mirwais Balki, he came to meet me. I asked him specifically, so what is this? Can you tell me? I think there is something sacred about it. He said, we call it Joy Shir, that is stream of milk. And it was the Shiva temple. So here, I should say, we are talking about recording this, that, but we have spent $3 billion in Afghanistan, but we have never given a thought to understand what is the centrality of Afghanistan's, and if the dunes is there, it has been occupied by all immigrants from Panjshir and other places, but still we could spend $1 million or less than $1 million in recreating that structure, or even the Gurdwara in Kabul is, they are in the Sikhs cremate their dead within the Gurdwara. They don't have any cremation place. So you have rightly pointed to Wakhan corridor as the dividing line between Tajikistan and Baluchistan. I again, given my experience, I was lucky to have traveled up to Langar, the last village of Wakhan, few years back, and I could see Gilgit myself. I didn't believe myself, just 14 kilometers from that point. And the lady Sarpanch said, this is India. She thought, I was surprised how it is India, but then I recomposed myself and now understood that it is Gilgit. And now you can imagine the catastrophic implications of the loss of Gilgit-Baltistan to India in 47-48 in geopolitical and strategic terms. Recently I heard an old resident of Baltistan. He's settled, I think, here in Dehradun or somewhere. So he was saying that still in Baltistan or Skardu, older people make 12 rotis, something thick rotis. So in the hope that Indian army will come and we will say, Abibi. I heard him speaking at some gathering. So Professor Chakravarthy has arrayed the wealth of archaeological and historical evidence to demonstrate closeness of India and Central Asia interaction. He has detailed the passes on Hindu Kush and routes from Ladakh to Tibet and Xinjiang. Chapter 4 outlines spread of Buddhism in Central Asia, points to existence of Buddhist sites in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Here it is pertinent to point out Dunhuang caves in China. These have been properly maintained and developed by Japanese funds, and these attract adequate international attention. Last year they say that 9 million tourists visited Dunhuang caves in 2018. But the remnants of Buddhists, now I am very happy that Dr. Mani is here. Ambassador Shri has already mentioned about Tamglitas. I also heard about it, and when during my visit to Almaty, Kazgu, Kazakhstan National University, I just mentioned it in my class. And a Muslim, a local Kazakh, he was so happy he volunteered to accompany me in his car. I gave the petrol and other expenses. We were moving. There is no signboard bhi nahi hai. With great difficulty we reached that. I told him that it is getting 6 now, how we will wander around the dunes. Then finally at the Illi River, on the banks of Illi River, beautiful Tamgalitas. These, nahi, abhi bhi hai, but some extremists are just trying to कुछ not much, but अभी भी है. हाँ नहीं, मैंने 2011 या 10 में मैं गया था. So what I mean to say, we are spending so much on Indian cultural centers. Archaeology could एक fiber glass का cover, and I trust me, there is no animus in the Kazakh political leadership or Uzbek or other about the pre-Islamic heritage. In fact, they take pride in including pre-Islamic heritage as part of their heritage, both in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Recently, Kazakhstan, he has Nazarbayev, in order to thwart this rise of extremism, he has floated the concept of Rohani Zongru, that means spiritual revival. It doesn't mean only Muslim shrines. You can, but I wish Archaeological Survey of India could reach out to this there are two tasks to be done. Number one is to bring out a compendium from your side of the existing remains of the Buddhist sites and other sites in Central Asia. You have yourself visited some. And Balashagun particularly, it is a very beautiful ancient Buddhist site, long site, but it is now flattened. There is something underneath. So tractors ply on the surface. So this, similarly, I was on the Tajik Badakhshan side, so I saw two ancient ruins of Kushan forts, Kahkaha and I don't know what is it. And then another Buddhist stupa. Japanese are visiting there. So there at least Thamgalitas is caring and other, they call for urgent attention. So if only a fiberglass cover is installed over Thamgalitas and similar other shrines, it would be great achievement. Now, boundary from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh has been dealt in detail in part 2 of the book. Professor Chakravarthy is right in saying that Tibet has been traditionally linked more to Indian Himalayas through trade, Buddhist connection and people-to-people contact rather than to China. Of my personal inquiry into records of that time, I have seen that goods like tea and other things would come from Kashgar to Leh and Leh to Lhasa through Gartuk, not from China to Gartuk or to Lhasa. So in fact the Treaty of Tingmosgang was signed in 1684. It fixed the border at Blari stream near Damchuk, and a treaty was again concluded between Tibetans and the Dogras at Leh on 17 September 1842, under which Tibetans accepted Dogras as the legitimate authority in Ladakh, and the old established frontiers were affirmed. The British Indian government had appointed two commissioners, Alexander Cunningham and Vance Agnew, and sent them to Ladakh in August 1846 to ascertain ancient boundaries between Ladakh and Tibet. But both the Chinese and Tibetan authorities evaded, and they did not want to give access to the British into Tibet. So they were met with the hostility of Tibetans, and there was no Chinese official to meet them. So finally, the Chinese Viceroy at Canton wrote to the British plenipotentiary at Hong Kong that a liberalized Chinese trade policy in Tibet would violate the treaties of Nanking. And as regards the border issue, King stated that borders of these territories have been sufficiently and distinctly fixed so that it will be best to adhere to this ancient arrangement. Now here I want to make a pointed comment is that Cunningham himself saw that a large stone was set up as permanent boundaries between the two countries, a line of demarcation from the village of Damchuk to the hill of Carbones. So whether we, after 1947, have cared to see whether the stone is still existing, nobody has ever cared to see. It was fixed there at Damchuk. So I doubt if it is there. Because I have traveled to Kazakh-Chinese border in Khargos and Alashinko, and the Chinese have made a point to set up big stones. Seemingly they say these are ancient stones, but these were not ancient. These were manufactured by them to write their own script that this is our ancient Chinese frontier between Kazakhstan and China. So, but in our case it was existing, but we are not cared to record it or preserve it or whatever it is. Now, implications of the study by Professor Chakrabarti need to be followed up by taking concrete steps, keeping in view current and upcoming challenges to our sovereignty on our borders, both in the north and the east. Our borderlands are under great stress due to open challenges to our sovereignty in Kashmir, Chinese position on our northern and northeastern frontiers. So borders need to be formally agreed, well documented, surveyed, recorded, and of course demarcated, maintained and well And boundary markers and monuments need to be erected, maintained, and borders monitored. So here again, I am very glad that Dr. Mani is here. I think you were the one who excavated Ambaran in Akhnur, the Buddhist stupa, and nobody, none else than him, we can't find a better person who can. At least I am telling you why, because I visited Kashmir a few years ago. So Shankaracharya temple, Shankaracharya hill, that is ancient, it has been renamed as Takht Sulaiman. And there, during my presence there, they were attributing it, no, archaeological survey has approved it. Is it? So they were saying that it has been approved. Then Hari Parbat has been renamed as Kohimaran. Now under this BJP alliance, the document, Common Minimum Program, Srinagar city, they inserted PDP very vilely. Shahri Khas, Srinagar city, it was set up by Pravat Singh and Ashok. Now it has been renamed as Malad, not official. It is there is time to erase Srinagar and do Shahri Khas, but on all local functionaries and otherwise they call it as Shahri Khas. And the smart city project is focused on Shahri Khas. They are erasing, because along the Jhelum there are dozens of ancient temples along the route, and otherwise, and so under this smart city project, which is done under central government funding 100%, all these things will be erased and done as part of this. They have devised a very carefully, very intelligent strategy of this Shahri Khas. Why I was somewhere outside India, so some tourists wanted to come to Kashmir, so I said, where are we going? He said, our travel agent has given us the itinerary. They have erased Avantipura ruins and Matan, Martha and everything. Shahri Khas, this Takht Sulaiman, Kohimaran and other. So I saw the itinerary myself, then I prepared another one for them. I don't know whether they went there or they could there. So I think Archaeological Survey of India, it is a national task, it is a very urgent task. You had done before, maybe in 40s or something, but now you need to bring out a compendium of ancient monuments and ruins that are still existent in Kashmir. You can include Jammu and Ladakh also, but Kashmir is focused. Why? Because I saw myself, I went to Avantipur, it is 10 years back. So the big mosque has come up. Just there is another that shrine on the road where drivers go and pay something and to seek safe passage. But the Ladies Mosque coming right adjacent to Avantipur ruins, and all the big huge stones, boulders have been used of these ruins in those mosques and in those structures. So it is necessary to record at least whatever is, and Archaeological Survey of India is the best thing, and for Central Asian republics also, they can do that. And I think Dr. Mani is the best person who can initiate this task. Another thing I would say as markers of, as testimony of Makbul Sherwani was killed by Pak raiders at the age of 19 in Baramulla in November 1947, defending Kashmir. He actually misled the Pakistani raiders to another route so that Srinagar was saved. There is the only small this plaque around just as Chota, isse bhi aadha outside the Baramulla cantonment. So nobody has thought of, because both Sherwani and Brigadier Ismail are rare symbols of heroism, patriotism of India's inclusive secularism. So concrete steps need to be taken to promote territorial symbolism, which plays important part in the construction of national identity and consolidation of frontiers. So with these words, I again fervently make a request that what Professor Chakravarthy has done is duty and foremost duty, but it needs to be followed up by concrete steps, not just quantifying or
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I found the Professor Chakravarty's book to be most fascinating and a major contribution to our understanding of India's historical geography as far as the territorial dimensions on the land frontier is concerned. So he's deliberately chosen the land frontier to be his focus of attention, and stretching right from Baluchistan up to Kashmir, and then from Ladakh onwards to Arunachal, and thereafter to the Myanmar border. He has sketched a wonderful account of the historical processes by which the neighborhood has been constructed, and historically how India has shaped that neighborhood. I have, since others have made many interesting comments, I want to make just a few comments that are of relevance in, from our perspective, and especially the fact that the study of the neighborhood or the borderlands is critically important from a political perspective because it poses real challenges to national security. And therefore, what kind of neighborhood we have, what kind of political geography is around us, is of critical importance to the survival and well-being of the state. Now, the Indian geography, the neighborhood geography that Professor Chakravarty mentions, has been historically shaped over a very long period of time, over 2,000 years of history. So there's a continuity in that. But it is also true that beginning with the 1850s onwards, several very important developments have reshaped that neighborhood in a significant manner. I want to discuss a few things on those in that aspect. The first was, of course, the rise of British power in its consolidation of its rule in India, which led the British to then find a secure boundary for India that will be secure in terms of the rising power of Russia. So the mid-19th century onwards, the Anglo-Russian struggle in the midst of Eurasia became a very critical factor in reshaping that neighborhood and the way the British went about doing buffer states in Afghanistan, in reaching agreements with Iran, in again creating a buffer state in Tibet, and then further down a buffer state in Thailand. All that, and then finally occupying Burma itself. All that was in part and parcel of a strategy for securing India's borderlands from other major powers, particularly at that point of time, Russia. In which case, of course, it made a major change in the overall role of Tibet in India's borderland. And that is to welcome China as the weak China at that point of time into playing a more important role in terms of filling the power vacuum which they thought Tibet needed. So in order to do that, this concept of suzerainty, etc., was evolved by the British, when actually the history that you rightly said indicates no Chinese sovereignty in Tibet ever. In fact, even the Qing period does not indicate Chinese sovereignty on Tibet. China was never a province of Tibet. It never, till 1912, when the Chinese Empire collapsed under the Qing Empire, Tibet was never a province of China. So at the maximum, which could be said, an alliance was formed between Tibet and the Chinese dynasty in order to save itself from encroachment by the Mongols, Zungas, etc. But that's about all. The Tibetans in 1842 reached an agreement with Ladakh, Tibet-Chusul agreement. It reached in 1856 a 100-year-old agreement with Nepal. It signed an agreement with the British in 1904, and then finally Tibet in 1912 recognized Mongolia, and Mongolia recognized Tibet. So, and then finally in 1914, Tibet along with China, sat in the Shimla Conference, although the entire history of the Shimla Conference and the way it was conducted remains not an easy topic to handle. But nonetheless, Tibet and Britain reached an agreement on the McMahon line. So there is a history of Tibetan exercise of sovereignty and a history of China's having no real claims on Tibet in terms of the historical data. The political side of it, of course, was very differently unfolded through the 20th century, and the fact of alliance politics of the First World War and particularly Second World War, when China was an ally for the British and the Americans, and finally became a permanent member of the Security Council, which meant that Tibet just could not be recognized and brought into the United Nations. So a particular kind of geopolitics in the development of the 20th century did deeply shape the history of one of our most important borderlands, that is Tibet, which you rightly show to have deep contacts and connections from Ladakh downwards to Arunachal, but also to Himachal, Uttarakhand, Bengal, the Buddhist influence, etc., deeply shaped the nature of Tibet and in terms of India-Tibet relationship, with huge amount of influence on Tibet's culture, scriptures, religion, architecture, which makes Tibet, the Indian influence in Tibet, perhaps the most important as compared to any other, including the Chinese. And in fact, the Chinese influence in Tibet, sporadic, was certainly limited by geography, and the road from Sichuan to China was the only major route, barring the Xinjiang route. And the Xinjiang route also was not a very secure route. It was not a very well-defined route on which large-scale trading could take place. So the major trading relationship were with the south, because it was close by and next to the Himalayas. The second point I want to make is the three other factors. Over a long period of his history, trade has played a very important role. Trade and religion played very important roles in shaping this Indian relationship with this borderland. Now, through the 20th century, however, two very important developments took place that ended this historical process. One was the rise of communism in Russia and Soviet Union, and then in China, and the philosophical idea that underpinned it in terms of no contact with the capitalist world. Therefore, trade and investment relationship with the Soviet Union and China were deeply affected by the world, and therefore India's trade and investment in this region, much of it now under Soviet rule or Chinese rule. Tibet was under Chinese rule from post-51 onwards, and the Central Asian region had gone under Soviet rule. So the old traditional networks of trade and relationship of trade with this borderland were totally disrupted because of the rise of this new political thinking, in which, along with the new economic thinking that went with it, where trade was not with the capitalist world was not to be undertaken. So there's entire disruption of this long durée of history that you mentioned, and this is a very important factor. But it was also added by an Indian economic philosophy, which also added to it. The inward-looking strategy in which trade investment played a very important role for the first 30-40 years of Indian post-1947 history has compounded this lack of trading relationship with some of our important neighborhood. And so I think the 20th century, the way it panned out, the Cold War, the rise of communism, the rise of inward-looking economic strategies that were against trade and investment connections with the borderland in particular, and the reshaping of the borderland in a fundamental way by the British when they did partition. Now, this partition, of course, has reshaped India's borderlands enormously. You make a very important point that the British tried to shape a series of agreements in order to secure India. And these were done mostly on very scientific lines, using the Thalweg principle or the principle of highest watershed. These are geographical principles to secure a boundary. Unfortunately, the British did not complete this process. They did not complete it in Kashmir. They did not complete it in Ladakh. They did not complete it in Himachal and that entire build up to Bhutan. The McMahon lines only started beyond Bhutan. And even the McMahon line was not finally publicized and an agreement reached with the Chinese that this is what it is. This is the final one. And finally, Tibet, when it went under the Chinese boot, the British and the Americans and the others just stood by. So there is this enormous geopolitical change that took place and the incomplete task of British map making that has affected us. The second, of course, was unlike this so-called principled, geographical principle-based borderlines, in the partition case, there was no principled basis of a borderline. There were no geographical principles that were followed, with deep implications for India's security. Now, of course, we are far removed from Iran, we are far removed from Central Asia. We now face Pakistan on our border, which is a different kettle of fish altogether. Therefore, rather than facing challenges from Central Asia or Iran from coming in, which is the historical record of the Afghanistan from coming in, what we find is the challenges, security challenges emerge right in the Indo-Gangetic Punjab belt next to India, far into the Indian subcontinent. And this has had enormous security impact. So I think, and the British, of course, played a direct role in creating partition, in supporting the Muslim League for that, and shaping the nature of the boundary, an unsettled, insecure boundary right in the midst of the Punjab plains and loss of Sindh province, which is civilizationally, since so much of this is about civilization of the Harappan, the Mohenjo-daro Harappan region from India. The divorcing that entire region from India is a deep. Similar thing was done in the east, the division of Bengal and the loss of Chittagong to Bengal and to therefore the northeast has made a huge impact on the landlocking of the northeast to the detriment of India and India's security. So, in short, both in the north and the west and in the east, the geopolitics of India's rearranged geography, the borderlands, has been a real change, and that's undergone since the whole of 20th century. And I believe, therefore, the reopening of India's trade investment post-1991 has great promise of reconnecting us to at least some of those areas that are not so badly affected, particularly Myanmar. And the fact that Myanmar itself is undergoing reforms, is no more under military rule, itself offers us great opportunity to restore the borderland, the traditional borderland, manage it better, expand it further into Myanmar, and build new ties there. So I think BIMSTEC and what kinds of things it can do in developing those are critically important. Also, Bangladesh today is a far better space for India's overall development and managing that border. In these, but there are real challenges both in the rise and expansion of China into Tibet and the neighborhood in terms of the coming challenges. No shortage of challenges in reshaping the Indian borderlands, but it can only be done if India opens up trade and investment into these areas critically, builds infrastructure, and really invests. You have all mentioned very importantly the investment that we need to make into archaeological sites, etc., of Indian history. But I think it is also very important to build roads, railways, and others across those borderlands so that we have permanent influence and reshape the politics of the region in order to shape a borderland that is favorable to India and deeply changed that it has become so the last 20th century.
Made a very, very important point, and which flows directly from the book, that if you have to restore borderlands, you have to also restore connectivity. So now I turn to our final panelist, Dr. Abhanti Bhattacharya, who is, as I said, Associate Professor at the Department of East Asian Studies. And her areas of interest are Chinese nationalism, China's foreign policy, Tibet, Xinjiang, India-China relations. So, Abhanti, 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm deeply honored to have been invited here and getting the opportunity to discuss such a fascinating book. In fact, when I received the invitation, I was spellbound, looking at the content of the book, which is, I think, the first of its kind today. And the second, in fact, Europhic moment for me was when I reached the last line of the book. And I quote, "Another thing this volume may have succeeded in underlying is that virtually all the overland foreign invasions in Indian history, from the Achaemenids to the Mughals, emanated from the borderlands of the subcontinent, and one cannot thus be sure of the extent to which they were foreign," unquote. This line is absolutely mind-boggling, and immediately I was connected with the Chinese history, because when you look into the Chinese government today's position on its borderlands, which they call periphery, and which they also have a very definite periphery strategy, you find the whole borderland or the periphery has dominated by the minorities, and their claim on this borderline is based on their past claims, particularly by sheer fact that the minority, barring the Tibetans and Uyghurs, were part of the Chinese dynastic rulers. In fact, if you look into the Chinese history, out of the 10 major dynasties ruling over China, 5 of them were non-Han minority dynasties. And therefore, what we find is interesting with these foreign invasions. China's claim on the borders is based on the claim of its foreign rulers. So that is interesting, and that also actually also tells us that their Chinese territorial claims are not backed by history or by geography or by archaeology or cultural, but mainly through selective understanding of history, as well through the minorities or foreign invasions. And yet, which Professor Chakravarthy demonstrates in his book throughout, our borderlands are backed by claims on the borderlands. In fact, we can claim it, but we never have claimed it. We have definite rights geographically, trade and economic linkages, spread of Buddhism, and above all, archaeological remnants. In most cases, it speaks volume about India's presence and influence, and quite likely dominance. He mentions the dominance on the borderlands. Yet we have never claimed these regions, and it is interesting to understand why. Not only we did not claim, but we did not even have brought bring these factors into our discussion with the Chinese. We have never brought the history factor in our discussion with the Chinese, which is actually the the irritant between India and China. History is the major factor, and it is history related to the borderlands. And when we are looking into this question raised, whether why borderlands, why invasions from outside, a very important study made by Brantley Womack when he was looking into the asymmetry of power related to the Chinese notion of tributary relations, these borderlands. So he makes the point that China almost was like a solid center, as in contrast to the Mediterranean liquid center. I think the same idea can be borrowed in the Indian case in Indo-Gangetic plain, or that even the Indus was at that point of time or maybe the Indo-Gangetic, I would say, after the Indus Valley civilization, served as a solid center, that is this resourceful base, which actually brought the foreigners from outside. So that is the strength of civilization. So that explains why we had a series of invasions, but we have never tried to territorialize the boundaries. So I tried to make 4 observations based on a very fascinating book which actually covered the geography, the archaeology, religion aspects, and particularly the rise of Buddhism, because our linkages were basically to the trade and Buddhism. And therefore, I made the first observation about our need to reopen our talks with the Chinese on the basis of history, going back to the history, and particularly if taking the case of Aksai-Chen, we have almost given up Aksai-Chen. It is no more in our debates, but it should be brought back on the Aksai-Chen area, where Professor Chakravarthy on page 155-56 adequately mentions, and he draws the attention to the Treaty of Chushul. The Treaty of Chushul, that's 1842, was about boundary of Ladakh and Tibet, which he says, and he refers to the fixed boundaries of Ladakh and its surrounding as fixed from ancient times. This is a quote from page 214, and he says, this gave India her clearest mandate of territorial positions from Ladakh towards Tibet and towards the Kunlun beyond the Karakoram, which used to be well reflected in the traditional trade routes between Leh, Yarkhan, Khotan, and also between Leh and Lhasa. Page 156, he says that this mandate was allowed to wither away due to the intransigence of both the British and the post-1947 Indian administration. And this is a telling commentary on how the borders call for clear appraisals and demarcations in the nation's own interest. This is page 157, and it's very fascinating, very illuminating. And the second point related to this whole going back to our borders and revisit the question with the Chinese is the fact that the Mansarovar and the Mount Kailash, which Ambassador Sikri also referred to, this abode of Lord Shiva, and quoting from Chakravarty's book, a pivotal point of Hindu mythology was located in the Tantrang region, thus suggesting an early link between India and this part of Tibet, page 201. Third point regarding this border, also Professor Chakravarthy highlights, which India needs to highlight, is that both in Tibet and China were under Mongol rule. Tibet between 1240 and 354, and China between 1279 and 1368 were under the Mongols. And therefore he says, the fact that the Mongols were the masters of both Tibet and China does not make Tibet an integral part of China. Culturally, Tibet, with its religion, religious iconography, script, and much of its religious literature derived from India, is more logically a part of Indian, not Chinese civilization sphere. This is page 158. So rightfully, India has claim on the Tibetan, southern Tibet, so to say. The fourth point I would like to draw attention, that is over Chinese claims on Arunachal Pradesh. And this claim, as also suggested by Ambassador Sikri, some 6th Dalai Lama was born in Arunachal Tawang area, and therefore they claim it. And such a claim is doubly faulty because Chinese claims are based on first fallacious and illegal claim on Tibet itself. While, as also Professor Chakravarthy clearly demonstrates, that India's claim on Arunachal Pradesh is backed by history and geography. Geographically, not only the McMahon line separated Tibet from Arunachal Pradesh, but as he says, the province has yielded an extensive series of 10th, 12th century sculptures of Hindu deities from places such as Malinithan, and has at least one major center of Hindu pilgrimage called Brahmakund in the valley of Lohit River. This is page 158. So this is the whole, we need to revisit our border from the perspective of history with the Chinese. My second observation, apart from this border claims, is which also Professor Chakravarthy highlights in his account on the Silk Route factor. He throws light on the problem in modern literature that has virtually seen the entire network of ancient trade in Asia as being associated with China and as silk. This is the problem he has highlighted. Though history and development of Silk Route is not his main concern, which he says, nonetheless, he successfully demonstrates the network of trade routes in Asia linking the subcontinent and clearly establishing the Silk Route, unlike the Chinese today BRI, was essentially a private trade route, not a Chinese route. And in this regard, on page 99, he says, the concept of Silk Route is the product of Western scholarship, which found in it the reflection of Rome's civilizing influence, reaching as far as east as the shores of Pacific. He then adds, to assign the importance of the Mediterranean-China linkage only to the fact of this linkage without adequately harping on the ramifications of the many subsidiary linkages which places like India maintained with it cannot always be the product of true historical imagination. He further argues that the main historical factor beyond Xuanzang's perilous journey was not any imaginary Silk Road, but the fact of Buddhism itself. It is very fascinating. He's connecting and in fact talking about not the Silk Road which brought Xuanzang or the later travelers, but it is the fact of Buddhism itself. And in that context, his discussion of the Silk Route, he not only highlights the importance of Buddhism from India played a role, but most tellingly he suggests, and I quote, the sites or the city-states of which they were apart at the edges of the Taklamakan desert were much like the Indianized states of Southeast Asia. Page 100. And he therefore suggests the political connotation of the spread of Buddhism in Central Asia. And there's very fascinating line on page 11. The story of Silk Route is also a story of the borderland and frontiers of the subcontinent. This is very fascinating when we are today looking at the BRI. My third observation is based on the British demarcation of the borders of the subcontinent, which Professor Suchidatta has highlighted. Professor Chakravarthy highlights all truth about this, how the basic geographical and historical elements guided the British Indian borderlands from Baluchistan to Arakan Yoma. In this context, we can actually bring and rather see critically Tanham's essay on strategic thought published in 1992. He mentions in that as a British Raj as one of the factors shaping strategic thinking, and he conceptualizes the British idea of buffer zones. I think that is contestable because it is not the British idea of creating buffer zone as a part of security strategy. It was essentially based on the existing historical and geographical reality, which Professor Chakravarthy has elaborated all through in his book. So and this is also has been done in the case of China, particularly those Tibetan, some of the Tibetologists from the West have looked into the idea of inner Tibet and outer Tibet, which the British have basically created, and they were based on the, not the British again creation. These were actually by the Qing, last Qing dynasty, the last Manchu dynasty, the Qing, who actually invaded and reached up to the eastern Tibet or the inner line area. And therefore they could not proceed further because of the great game between the British and the Russians. Otherwise they would have turned the West Tibet, which is the central, the Lhasa, the Dalai Lama's area, central Tibet, under its direct provincialization, which they had already done in the case of Xinjiang in 1884, in the case of Taiwan in 1887, their first attempt. And so therefore you find that the whole categorization of inner Tibet, outer Tibet, or inner Mongolia, outer Mongolia, they were also based on the earlier historical developments, not a British creation. And arguing that British boundary demarcated was not random, Professor Chakrabarti on page 212 says that the text of the treaties suggests that the principle of natural boundary line based on particulars, rivers or mountain ranges was followed in all cases. This is very true, while they have geographically defined it, which Professor Datta also mentioned, but they have actually not taken care of the ethnic populations. And that is the major problem what we have faced today with regard to the Pashtun division in Afghanistan. And therefore the whole fight between the Pakistanis and the Afghanistan and the ramification for our Indian security. Durand Line, 1893 Durand Line. So, and my final observation is on the significance of history textbook. Particularly his book is, I think, path-breaking, gives a, particularly as borrowing from Rajiv Sikri's idea of India, and particularly detailed picture of the territoriality of the ancient India, thereby presenting a clear understanding of Indian power in the ancient past, in the nation history, and thereby we need to actually put our records straight. What was our Indian geographical, historical identity? And we need to also move away from the domination of liberal leftist understanding of history, because for past 70 years almost, our understanding of history has been shaped by left liberal perspective that views history from the perspective of contestation and conflict, and does not bring into the richness and to the achievements of India, and that is problematic. And also that is internally how our academic has shaped up. It has also been influenced by the Cold War academic focus on the IR theories. In fact, American literature, American academics had moved away from the history factor, and literally now their own historical sources have dried up. They are now coming back post-globalization. You see, post-globalization in the sense to post-2008 crisis, they seem to go back to the history, and they do not find any historians of that order which they had earlier. And now they are borrowing some of the studies from Asia to again focus on the history factor. So we have to bring our history back. And here I'm compelled to compare with China's case in 1990s. We see China's rise of China is 1990s, rise of China. And the first thing they did, rise of China is also the time when this whole rise of nationalism. And the first thing they did was going back to the roots. And therefore they brought back what is called Shui studies, bringing the earlier past, Confucian's text back into the picture. And therefore the rise of nationalism is seen, and the whole patriotic education program has been seen based on bringing history in the academic, not only in the school textbooks, also at the graduation level about Chinese history. And so that is very important, because any countries, in my understanding, greatness, nation cannot be powerful or achieve a great power status on a borrowed ideology. We need to we have to go back to our indigenous source of our understanding of India. And therefore, to do this, we need to go back to history. And in this context, I believe and I find Professor Chakravarty's book is unparalleled and seminal. Thank you.
Very good. I think that was a wonderful intervention, remarks that you have made. I think this discussion has thrown some very fundamental points. One is about the whole idea of India that we are accustomed to. And I think we need to we had gone to sleep for the last 70 years for various reasons that you mentioned. I just need to probably start rethinking about ourselves. And unless we do that, we will not be able to reclaim our place, which is well deserved in the Comity of Nations. So I think these studies are very important, and you have called this an unparalleled book, and I think one would agree with that. So let me